Everybody doing all right? Yeah? It's nice-ish. It's not snowing.
You sure? Okay, well, I'll pass the mic to you anyways.
Yeah.
I was just asked to do this. I don't know why, but I would like to introduce to everyone Chad Williams, that many of you know, and that's why you're here. He's a professor at Brandeis University of History, and he's written this incredible book that, those of us who read sometimes think we know about things until a book comes around and we look at it and say, what? And you start looking at it and you suddenly realize there's a whole world about E.B. Du Bois that we didn't even know about. And so this was fantastic. He is being questioned by Allie Cooper.
Abby Cooper.
Abby Cooper,
Yep.
who's also a professor at Brandeis. And I'd like to welcome you all again and thank you so much for coming. And if you haven't bought a book, please buy one or two so you can give it a gift to someone else. Or three would be nice.
Please
So-
introduce yourself.
Oh, I am Ramin Abrishamian. I am a board member for Needham Diversity Initiative, who is also a co-sponsor of this event. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to do another introduction because I want to talk about a decade ago when I had a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old and an unfinished dissertation and this R1 brand school with these illustrious historians welcomed me in, and I wrote about the Civil War and Black refugees, and I did not have a very rosy picture of Black male military service. Basically, the gist of it is that they say, you should get land to be free, but also now you're a soldier, go over there, you can't have this land. And so I was pretty sure that the man who wrote first book, Torchbearers of Democracy by Chad Williams, about how Black men serving their country in World War I was a way to prove their citizenship. I was pretty sure I was going to have a bit of a rough time. And instead, oh my gosh, it was just like coming home. He was a dad and a great dad and an academic, and he didn't just run a AAAS department, African and African American Studies department. He built a AAAS department after Brandeis wanted to cut it. And he made me feel so welcome. And there was a big poster there of a little known writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates, who had just given a talk. And I had him all over my footnotes, and my advisor and the mandarins of the field told me to cross that person out. And I felt something crack, but I came, and when I talked to Chad, it was made whole again. And I thought, I can have the kind of discussions I've had to whisper with this man, with this academic, and with the students that he was going to have in my classrooms. And it's still true. And I actually hate going on leave because then I lose that generation and they don't know me and they don't know me and you.
You should never hate going on leave, okay? Always take advantage of going on sabbaticals, right?
But it is amazing to have his students in my classroom. It changes the dynamic. And I want to say, because it's not a time when Afro-pessimism and reparations were two words that people didn't say, now are all over the place. That's because 3 years ago, you and I, outside right here, I'm gonna keep dropping things, that's just, I'm imagining I'm on a screen and you can't see down here. I remember when we were at the George Floyd vigil, I remember, because I had never gotten so many white people to come out to a protest against police brutality. And we heard the names, and I had high school students asking why this was important, and we had discussions, and 3 years later, we have a 16-year-old ring a doorbell and be shot twice and have the white man who shot him let go. We haven't solved anything. But I can tell you that the problem of democracy is still on the agenda, and the voices of Black people who have sought to make it better are the only ones that we cannot cut out if we are going to understand what democracy means. And the beauty of this book is that W.E.B. Du Bois was stuck because when he tried to write it in his most fustian, Harvardian, academic, objective voice, they still said, "You did it too much from the perspective of the Negro troops." And so here we have somebody who is trying to do everything right and still couldn't get this book published. But you know what he did? On his deathbed, he said, "I give it to someone else." And then
So many words. Yeah.
Chad Williams writes Torchbearers of Democracy. And this is why when you feel cynical or pessimistic, or you feel like it's not going to happen in my lifetime, put on my epitaph, "She tried." Well, it's not over. It's never too late to say you're sorry. It's never too late to repair. And that's what this book does. And then this book is a love letter to the man who he found. I can just see that archival find of finding an almost finished.
I could tell the story. I'll tell the
Yes,
story.
please tell the story. I gotta tell you, there's so much heart in this book because it's a relationship, and it's a long-term relationship that you've had with
Very long-term relationship.
this. So
Kind of dysfunctional too.
yeah. Start us off because we just have to solve it in like 30 minutes. That's
Right.
okay. It'll be. So start us off with how you got into this book.
Well, I mean, thank you for your lovely introduction, Abby, and your words and your inspiration and really situating us in the moment that we're in, because I think this book, in many ways, does speak to our moment, and I wanted it to. But first, let me take a step back, and say a little bit about the person who this book is about, W.E.B. Du Bois. For those of you who are not familiar with Du Bois, he's arguably the greatest Black intellectual, scholar, activist in American history. He's probably one of the greatest intellectuals, period, in American history. He lived an absolutely incredible life. He was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, during the presidency of Andrew Johnson. He died in August of 1963, literally the day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. 95 years of life, commitment to the cause of Black freedom, justice, and democracy. He was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. He studied at the University of Berlin. He wrote an incredible 22 single-authored books in history, sociology, literature, spanning every discipline imaginable. He was at the forefront of the emergence of what we now think of as the modern civil rights movement. He co-founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was the editor of its journal, The Crisis. He was literally involved in every issue facing Black people in the United States and throughout the entire African diaspora during his lifetime. There was truly no other individual like him. So I wanted to write about him. And a lot of other people have written about Du Bois, but there's one piece of his life that no one had written about. When I was working on this book, or the dissertation that would become this book, I was doing research at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. This was back in 2000. I'm dating myself. And I had seen a reference to Du Bois' World War I materials. And I didn't know what it was. I thought, okay, I'm doing a dissertation on Black soldiers in World War I. This sounds like it could be interesting. It's Du Bois. Let me check it out. I go to the library, special collections, and of course the W.E.B. Du Bois Library. This was just like fate waiting for me. I asked to see these Du Bois World War I materials. The librarian returns with 6 microfilm reels. And for those of you who are, I guess I'm old enough to still use microfilm, you load the reel, you crank it, and I see a manuscript, an 800-page manuscript by W.E.B. Du Bois on the Black experience in World War I that he never finished and was never published. In addition to that, all of his research materials and all of the correspondence related to this book that he spent 20 years working on, that he titled The Black Man and the Wounded World. And no historian had ever written about it before. I was literally astounded. And I knew from that moment on I wanted to learn more about this book. I wanted to learn more about what it was about, but I also wanted to know, obviously, why he didn't finish it, but why it was so important to Du Bois's life, why it was so important to his work, his intellectual development, his political evolution, and ultimately what it tells us about the struggle for Black freedom and democracy in the 20th century, which Du Bois was such a central figure in. So that's how this big book kind of originated, and I'm glad it's out now.
Like a birth, right? Like it's.
Yeah.
I love that story because I would have been really tempted to just be like, by Chad Williams, dissertation done. Because
I mean, my first instinct was like, sure, I could finish Du Bois's book for him. Yeah, I'm that guy, right? Of course, my advisor was like, no, you're going to finish your dissertation. You can come back to it later. So I took her advice, which was very good. I got my first book done. But again, I knew that I wanted to come back to it because there was just so many unanswered questions that I had.
So I guess let me ask you about how your relationship with the Mandarin you just painted, because that is how people who know Du Bois know him as perfect. Actually, he's probably triplets. Like there's no way that a human man can do as much as he did. How esteemed, how amazing, but then there's something that happens to him over the course of this book. It's about his failure. So, how did your relationship change with Du Bois, or your point of view, perspective on Du Bois change over the course of this project?
Yeah, it definitely evolved, and you're absolutely right. Failure is not a word that we would associate with such a monumental figure like Du Bois. And I think it was a challenge for me to embrace that, to think of Du Bois as a failure, right? That he ultimately didn't complete what would have been one of his most significant works of history. I'm convinced by this. It would have been the definitive history of the Black experience in the war. But ultimately, that failure spoke to the failure of the subject he was trying to write about, and that was World War I. World War I, as Du Bois wrestled with it over the years, became a failure. It became a tragedy. It became, as he wrote about, one of the darkest moments in modern world history. And he had to reckon with that, especially because he supported the war. He initially believed that the war was going to be a turning point in the history of democracy for Black people in the United States and throughout the African diaspora. He put his credibility on the line in encouraging African Americans to support their country, in spite of all of the horrific things that they had been experiencing: Jim Crow, discrimination, racial violence, voter disenfranchisement. We can go on and on and on, right? This poignant question that Black people had to wrestle with. What did it mean to support your country when your country doesn't support you? Question that we're still wrestling with today. So Du Bois had to wrestle with the failure of his decision to support the war, the ultimate failure of the war. And as I argue in the book, that was that's ultimately what led to the failure of him to complete his own book. And so that was definitely challenging. That was a different type of Du Bois I had to accept. Um, but it ultimately allowed me to appreciate his complexity, to appreciate his vulnerability, and to appreciate his humanity. I think the Du Bois that we get in my book is deeply human, deeply flawed, someone that we can relate to because we've all failed in different ways. We've all made decisions that we ultimately come to regret. I mean, he made it was a big decision on his part, but it was that failure that allowed him to grow, to evolve, and to ultimately become, as I write about in the book, a radical peace activist by the 1950s. So failure was challenging in terms of my thinking about Du Bois, thinking about the book, but it was also very generative and fruitful as well.
And I'm gonna like take a stab at the well, there are, it is actually possible to give a spoiler in this because these
That's
are
okay, go ahead.
really,
Yeah.
really, but there's something that he writes called Closed Ranks. He writes an editorial, Closed Ranks, after he's published The Crisis, knowing that the problem of the 20th century and the 21st century is the color line. He knows there's a crisis, and yet Closed Ranks is the editorial he writes. Tell us a little bit about Closed Ranks.
Right. So Du Bois supports the war, as I said, when the United States enters the war in April of 1917. President Woodrow Wilson, excuse me, the world is going to be made safe for democracy, right? This grand ideal that Wilson and the United States has for the war, and Du Bois is swept up in it. Right? He believes, from his own vantage point, that the war, as I said, is going to be this definitive moment in the transformation of democracy. He's hearkening back to other moments of American warfare and black military service, especially during the Civil War, when black Union soldiers fought for their freedom and fought for their citizenship. Right? As Frederick Douglass famously said, let the let the black man put the brass letters U.S. on his chest, and no one can deny that he is a citizen and deserves his freedom. Right? I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that was the gist of it. Right? So he's coming out of this tradition of linking black military service to the expansion of black citizenship rights. And he believes the war is going to be a turning point. He puts aside his pacifist principles to support the war, and ultimately he writes arguably the most controversial editorial of his career, Closed Ranks, in the July 1918 issue of The Crisis magazine, which he edited, and he encourages African Americans to set aside their special grievances. Set aside their special grievances. As I said, lynching, Jim Crow, voter disenfranchisement, economic excellence, put all that to the side for the moment and support your country. Close ranks with your fellow white Americans and the allies that are fighting for democracy, right? And he is criticized like no other moment in his life. He's accused by his harshest critics of being a traitor to the race. And for someone like Du Bois, who literally dedicated his life to the cause of uplifting his race, of fighting for his people, to be called a traitor was probably the harshest criticism that you could levy at him. So this was a very contentious moment in Du Bois's life, politically, but also personally as well. But Closed Ranks really spoke to Du Bois's belief that African Americans could come out of this war being closer to being a full American than at any other point in their history. Du Bois wrote his most famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903. And in that book, he talks about double consciousness, this tension that African Americans experience between being black on the one hand and being American on the other. These two unreconciled ideals, these two warring ideals, as he describes it in that book. And he believed that the war was an opportunity to reconcile those two warring aspects of black identity. And he actually talks about, in his later years, reflecting that he felt during the war closer to being an American, a full American, than at any other point in his life or sense. So Du Bois, as cynical as we may want to think of it in hindsight, truly believed what he was saying, what he was writing, that this was going to be a defining moment. And he was wrong, and he had to wrestle with the weight of being wrong, of that failure.
I can't help wonder, and I wonder too that you reviving this ends up being germane to a point that I really didn't know, that this book on World War I was going to be part of a series, a follow-up to his very famous, I brought it along. It's,
More props.
yeah, more props. Real books. They say my students still love them too, and they have both the PDF and the book. It's you know, we got to just, it's like when they brought vacuum cleaners into our lives and we're like, why do I have more work? But now with Black Reconstruction, it's something that absolutely replaced the very racist textbooks that basically said Black people weren't ready for freedom, that's why Reconstruction was doomed. Instead, Du Bois says Reconstruction was a success. It was a brief moment in the sun. And that idea isn't just something he's thinking of with the past. He's actually paying it forward. It's what he imagines for this. So could you tell us a little bit about the possibility he imagined with this book and some of the obstacles he went up against?
So as I said, Du Bois spent 20 years trying to write his book, which he titled the Black Man in the Wounded World, this incredibly evocative title. So that's why I had to steal it for the title of my book, because it's just so good. But his conceptualization of the book evolved over time, which of course makes sense. He worked on it for such a long period of time, and he had to reckon with current events as they're unfolding throughout the 1920s and 30s, many of which had directly to do with the legacies of the war. All right, so for example, he starts working on the book in October of 1918, literally right before the armistice ending World War I. He travels to France the following, a couple months later, in December of 1918, spends 3 months in France during the Versailles Peace Conference, where he's talking with Black soldiers. He's literally on the Western Front, in the camps, talking with Black soldiers and officers about the racial discrimination that they experienced in the United States Army, right? Seeing with his own eyes just the horrific devastation of the war. And this is really the beginning of this long process of disillusionment that he reckons with, beginning with his time in France, returning back to the United States in the summer of 1919, during what James Weldon Johnson calls the Red Summer, where race riots are erupting in Chicago, Washington, D.C., massacres in the South, Black veterans being lynched, some wearing their uniform, right? He has to wrestle with all of this, the continued disillusionment of the war and its outcomes throughout the 1920s and 30s. Many of those disillusionments, as I write about in the book, very personal. So his view of the war changes, becomes more cynical, more tragic, and the book itself reflects that. The title reflects that, The Black Man and the Wounded World. And I think Du Bois ultimately is wrestling with an incredibly profound question. What does it mean to live in a wounded world? What type of world did the war create? A world that's wounded by violence, by the scars of war, by white supremacy, by economic exploitation, by empire and colonialism. What does it mean to live in a wounded world and to have to write about that wounded world that you are also a part of? So he faced an incredibly daunting challenge in trying to write his book, one that he ultimately was not able to overcome.
I think one of the things I really struggled with as I watched him come very close, then have arguments, and come very close
So
and have
close,
more
so many
arguments.
times, he was
so
so
many
close.
times, it's right there. So, so much on that laptop. But there's this thing where people keep saying it's the voice. It's so bitter. Can you make it less bitter? And he says no. And I'm so aware that when we are creating scholarship, we try to create some kind of distance when we know it's not just our prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is definitely being triggered when you're talking about death and race and injustice. So you see this man finding this way to communicate with other people and doing it well, and yet being unbending in that voice. And so I wonder, do you feel like when you were reading it, did you root for him to keep punching, or did you kind of root for him to just
Let it go.
just let it go? Yeah.
No, I mean I understood at the end, what he was doing, what he was trying to do. You're right, Du Bois was uncompromising, and that's part of why he wasn't able to get his book finished. As I write about in the book, he applied for funding support from pretty much every major foundation and philanthropy you could name, you could think of, and was routinely denied, right? Because, oh, you're too bitter. We don't think that this is going to sell. This book doesn't conform to our principles, right? All these excuses, which he had heard time and time again throughout his life. He was used to it, right? Du Bois was always on the margins of mainstream academia, right? And he accepted that. And I think that's where he preferred to be, because he was allowed to be uncompromising in his voice, in his arguments, and that's part of his greatness. Um, I certainly would have loved for him to get his book done, uh, but I think the struggle of him trying and ultimately failing to write his book is also incredibly powerful, and that's what I wanted to try and capture in the book I wrote.
I want to say too that I'm glad that more and more people are just becoming familiar with Du Bois. But I, in general, am somebody who says, "Oh, another biography," because I always love, lots of marginalized voices, more and more voices. I can't tell you how original this read was, because you saw this wasn't the prophet in the same way that everyone talks about Du Bois as the prophet, because he saw what was coming and he was able to speak in this register that combined secular and spiritual and really showed us what democracy was going to be, and really didn't want fascism to be there and kept fighting it off. And it was so hard to not see how prescient it was, but at the same time, you saw him making the wrong mistakes again and again, but still, fascism had to wait another day. So I think one of the things I want to think a little bit about is how one of the things I saw you do is you narrated his change. The first part is called hope, the third part is called disillusionment. And I know, as we have a man who dies in 1963, but he's not dying on American soil, he's dying in Africa. And I would like to tell us a little bit about that journey, and I want us to figure out a little bit about how I still see Du Bois as far more the center than the left. I think he gets seen as the left and I think the left got foisted onto him more than he chose it. And I wanted to kind of bat that at you, and I'm actually saying I might have taken this book differently if I had read it in 2018. But I can tell you, this summer, first time I went back to conferences in person, and anytime I told stories and I felt like I was making that history centered on Black voices, people would talk to me and say, "Oh, my uncle's a card-carrying member of the left," or I know leftists too. And I was like, and I said, okay, well, I was just talking about empathizing with black people, but if you say see left, then okay. But do you have to be leftist
Right,
in
right.
order to
Believe that black
empathize with
people
black
are
people?
human beings.
Yeah. So I'm right now in this position of saying, okay, did Du Bois choose to keep going left, or did he keep trying to push back fascism
Mm,
that was and white supremacy that everybody kept saying wasn't there, but he could see, and the only way he found the language was in what other people saw as left.
right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, does Du Bois evolve to the left, or does the world keep moving to the right? Yeah, I think one of the, I mean, I spent a lot of time writing this book. I didn't think it was going to be 12 chapters when I started writing it. Du Bois's life just kept getting longer and longer and longer. But his connections to the legacies of World War I also kept getting longer and longer, and I kept seeing these threads, running throughout his life, his politics, his evolution, throughout the 1930s, 40s, into the 1950s, where I ultimately in the book, where Du Bois is, as you said, moving further to the left. And part of that evolution that he experiences, over the course of his lifetime, really does have to do with his, reckoning with the legacies of the war and his own principles and his own beliefs. Du Bois supported World War I, encouraged African Americans to close ranks in 1918. In 1951, the federal government tries to put Du Bois in jail because he was advocating for peace. He was part of an organization called the Peace Information Center, and he was indicted by the federal government on charges of being an agent of a foreign principal, right? Basically being a mouthpiece for the Soviet Union, right? Simply for advocating for peace, right? He's 83 years old at the time. The federal government is going to put him in jail, right? I mean, it's kind of this remarkable evolution, right, of Du Bois supporting what turns out to be one of the most horrific wars in modern history, right, to literally facing imprisonment, right, for being an anti-war advocate, right? So I wanted to really try and make sense of that evolution and his radicalism, right? And I do think, I mean, he does move to the left, right? I mean, he does, begin to, embrace, radical Marxism. Eventually he joins the Communist Party before he leaves for Ghana in 1961. So certainly his politics become more radical, but at the same time, the United States and the world is becoming more reactionary, right? And he's struggling with that reality, right? How the world that he had been trying to make better, right, to make democracy a reality, is becoming more and more distant, right, as the years go on, right? So again, this is, the arc of the book, the hope, the disillusionment, the failure, right, where I end the book in the last section. And part of that failure is also the failure of democracy itself, right? And, quite frankly, that's a failure that we're still wrestling with today, which is, again, why I think this book does speak to our moment.
I want to make sure that I open it up to questions because I have at least 17 more, but
We work together.
I
She
do
knows where to
know,
find me. It's okay. All right? Wanna hear from you
exactly.
guys.
But it doesn't feel like a Monday, but it is also a Monday night, and I have tweens who are in the library.
Good for them.
So
Yeah, we can open up.
yeah, so I'm going to open it up to questions. You can raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone. How's that sound?
Hi. I was curious about one thing. I mean, as you described, Du Bois was an evolving person, but he started this book pretty early. And I was wondering, aside from the funding issues, how much do you think of his inability to finish the book was actually the result of his constantly being a new person every few years.
Yeah.
And that what he wrote at the beginning that
Yeah.
many years ago was no longer represented him in his attitude.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, great observation. So he begins writing the book as this kind of vindicationist history of black soldiers in the war. Again, one of the things I talk about in the book is his very close personal relationship with black veterans. They're the ones who give him the bulk of his research materials for the book. He's asking them, give me your materials so I can make the history of the war authentic and irrefutable, right? In the face of all the racist slander that's already starting to be produced, as early as 1918, 1919. So black veterans are giving him letters, diaries, military documents, photographs, all of this incredible material, which he feels a responsibility to to protect, to own, which he does. He doesn't return their stuff back to them, but he's initially envisioning this history as really demonstrating how black soldiers helped save the world and democracy, right? By the 1930s, he's envisioning the book as an explicitly anti-war book, right? It's not a coincidence that he stops working on the book, or at least stops trying to get funding for it, in 1940. And we all know why 1940 is important, right? He's actually in Europe, in Germany, in the summer of 1936. Yeah, right? Then he's in China and Imperial Japan after that. So he literally sees World War II on the horizon. He comes back to the United States and says, I need to finish this book because the world needs to see what can happen. The next World War is going to be even worse than the first one. And he was right. But his disillusionment was so profound by that time that he didn't want to keep working on the book anymore. So yeah, the book absolutely evolves along with his views, his politics, and his disillusionment.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, and I'm so excited to read your book.
Thank you.
And I haven't yet, so my question is a little ignorant. But
No ignorant questions.
um, could you please talk more about what exactly was it about World War One or Black participation in World War One that he saw as promising? And then what was his perspective? I mean, you just touched on it a little bit just now, but by the time of World War II, what was his perspective, and yeah, how had it changed?
Yeah, great question. Du Bois considered himself a pacifist. He did. But he also believed in democracy. He also believed in the transformative potential of black military service. And he believed that it was possible for black people, by fighting for their country, to become closer to being full American citizens. And he believed World War I was potentially that opportunity, was that moment. He admitted later on that he was swept up in the moment. The hyper-patriotism of the war, the incredible propaganda that came along with World War I, as well as the coercion that came along with World War I. Part of one of the reasons why he wrote Close Ranks is because the federal government was breathing down his neck, right? Make sure that you don't say anything too controversial, right? So he was dealing with kind of all of these incredible pressures during the war, but ultimately believed that if black people demonstrated their worth, right, literally shedding their blood for their country, right, that America would respond, right? And that didn't happen, right? And by World War II, he's much more cynical, right? He ultimately, as the United States enters the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as the black press is kind of dredging up, the bones of his Close Ranks editorial, he's like, look, we're going to do our part because we have to, like we've always done. But make no mistake, we didn't have democracy before World War II, and we're not going to have it afterwards. So he's much more kind of clear-eyed about what the Second World War is going to mean. But ultimately, he uses that, as an opportunity to further, his radical agenda, for African liberation, for peace, for economic justice, in the United States and elsewhere.
And raise your hand, I'll come around.
So, following up on this question, I'm a bit puzzled. He must have been really familiar with the results of the black participation in the Civil War.
Yes.
That didn't quite work out well. So why would he have thought that this distant war? I mean, it's again repeating the same question, because that, in the light of that experience, what would have made him think that this one was going to be any different or better?
So we could have a whole conversation about this book. You see, she's
I'm sorry,
she's
did I
chomping at
open
the
up a
bit
can
back
of
here.
worms here?
So
go
let me
ahead.
talk, Abby. Jeez.
Go ahead, go ahead.
All right. So I think if you read this brilliant book, Du Bois is very clear. He says black soldiers won the war. He says there would not have been a Union victory.
But they weren't recognized for that.
They, but see, that's why he wrote this book, right? And it depends on your perspective, right? And it depends on how you're thinking about the aftermath of the war, right? Of the Civil War, right? Du Bois is saying that Reconstruction, the aftermath of the war, was in fact a success, right? He describes it as a splendid failure, right? This was when the United States actually demonstrated its democratic potential, what democracy could actually look like. If only they had committed to it, if they hadn't capitulated to the forces of white supremacy and capitalist greed and all the rest, right, then perhaps America would be a democracy. Perhaps the world would be more democratic. Perhaps we wouldn't have had the conditions that ultimately led to the First World War. He's actually making that connection, that through line, right? Connecting the failures of Reconstruction to the rise of white supremacy on a global scale, right? Of empire and economic exploitation in Africa and elsewhere, which he saw as the roots of World War I. Okay? So, to get back to your question, he saw, at least at the time, right, that World War I, the Great War, as it was being called, right, could be a moment akin to the Civil War, and that the aftermath of it could potentially be another Reconstruction, right? He was thinking about that type of second Reconstruction, both domestically as well as internationally as well, right? So I don't think he was being naive, right? I think he was being very hopeful, right? There's something very profound in his hope, something very visionary in his hope. It didn't materialize
Just to
during his
follow up
lifetime.
to
It still
that.
hasn't, but yeah.
So
yeah.
he had the vision, and he was a pacifist, at least pacifistic, feelings about
Yeah.
this. What was his reaction or support or involvement with the League of Nations that came after the First War?
Again, this is Du Bois. He evolves. I mean, he's in Paris. He's in France while Wilson is in France trying to create the League of Nations. Right? It's this remarkable moment of, as Du Bois described it, the destinies of mankind, being centered in France. And Du Bois is there. He organizes a landmark Pan-African Congress, which he hopes was going to influence the peace treaty. But at the time, excuse me, he sees the League of Nations as a good thing, as being absolutely essential to protecting the rights of black people, particularly in Africa and other parts of the diaspora. But as the years go on, like everybody else, he becomes incredibly cynical about the League of Nations, especially after the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. He sees that as really kind of the African roots of the next world war, right? If Italy can invade Ethiopia and the League of Nations does nothing about it, what's going to stop Germany from enacting, their campaign of aggression? Might not be in Africa, it could be in Europe, right? He's saying this, right? And we all know what happened, right?
Yeah, Africa plays such a large role in this book that it's really, really makes you reformat your Eurocentric thinking. I saw hands. Yes, please.
Thank you.
One in the back also.
Did Du Bois have a relationship with Woodrow Wilson, and if so, how would you characterize it?
Oh boy, I wish someone would write like the Du Bois Wilson book. I couldn't do that, but I almost went down that rabbit hole. It's really fascinating.
He's Princeton, by the way, Princeton alum.
Yeah, but I don't. Yeah, not.
This is like
I'm not that kind of Princeton. I'm
Yeah.
not Woodrow Wilson Princeton.
has Wilson all over the buildings.
Yeah.
Sorry to throw you off.
Excuse me. No, I was just thinking about my experience in the graduate college at Princeton. Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, he supported Woodrow Wilson's candidacy in 1912. When the majority of African Americans, the overwhelming majority of African Americans, were still voting Republican, Du Bois says, you know what, Wilson, erudite, educated scholar. He's not a rabid white supremacist like these other Southerners. Let's give him a chance. He's got the opportunity to be the next Abraham Lincoln. He's actually saying this. Wow, right? He is very quickly reminded of how disastrous that decision was. After Woodrow Wilson segregates the federal bureaucracy, after he screams "Birth of a Nation" in the White House, right? After he invades Haiti, on and on and on, right? So shortly after Du Bois certainly doesn't encourage voting for him again in 1916. But they have this interesting synergy. I think the first time Du Bois, help me out here, Professor Cooper, Du Bois writes his article on the Freedmen's Bureau in the Atlantic Monthly, I believe maybe 1901 or so, right, writing about Reconstruction in the Atlantic Monthly. Woodrow Wilson has an article in the same exact issue, or maybe not the same issue, at least that year, also in the Atlantic Monthly, talking about Reconstruction, right, from completely different vantage points, right? So you have these two scholars, these two historians, these two men who believe in democracy, but from completely different perspectives, right? So there's this strange kind of respect that Du Bois has for Woodrow Wilson, and simultaneous disgust as well, right? It's really fascinating. Like I said, I wanted to. Maybe that's an article I could write at some point.
I want to tell
it's really
you,
interesting,
that, and all the, if you can feel the bristle there, because you can look back and say, oh, how naive, or oh, how accommodationist of him, but I can't tell you, especially now when we're so hungry for stable institutions, how you see this hope inside the idea that if we can communicate with each other intelligently, then surely we can see each other. And Du Bois has this beautiful quote where, I'm going to paraphrase it too, but where he says, the problem is they just don't know. They just don't know. All we need to do is teach and exchange. And once they know, then we can begin to solve. And where the disillusionment hits is when he sees, oh, they know. They know.
Right.
And they don't care. Yes.
Really fascinating, really is. Congratulations. Some people have said that they think the military really embraced African Americans and gave them a fair shot at life in America as free people and good jobs. And do you agree?
Yes and no. Yeah, I mean, I write about this in my first book, that even, as far back as World War I mean, we could even look at the Civil War. The serving in the military was absolutely an opportunity for many African Americans, and it still is. Um, at the same time, the military has a deeply racist history and legacy, and that history and legacy still exists, right? To the military's credit, I mean, they've tried to address it, but there's no denying that that's a part of its legacy and its contemporary reality. Um, I think that racism is still deeply embedded in the institutional structures of the United States military. From its leadership on down, to the fact that you have um, very dangerous currents of white supremacy, in many of the, especially the lower ranks of the Army and other branches. So there's, this tension that I think African Americans have always faced in serving in the military, right? How do you serve a country that doesn't serve you, right? How do you serve? How do you fight? How do you risk your life for a country that oftentimes doesn't respect your citizenship and your humanity, right? Du Bois, in writing his book, was trying to articulate that tension and to write about it through the experiences of black soldiers in World War I. And again, he knew many of these men personally. So this wasn't like just theoretical for Du Bois. He was deeply connected to the history that he was writing about, which made it all that more challenging to write about, right?
I have one last question, and then this is good for your end.
Oh, really? Okay.
You can feel free to ask him questions after.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I live here, so yeah, you know where to find me.
This might be a good one to end the collective part, the official part. And I just a question about our current moment a little bit. There's been a lot of great stuff recently about why something like Black Reconstruction in America should be reread and revisited. Martha Jones had a really great piece about that last year. So just wanted to ask the same question to you about both Du Bois's book and yours. Just some thoughts quickly anyway on why we should be reading these things now, how they can speak to 2023 as well as the century between World War I and now.
Yeah. Read anything and everything by Du Bois. I mean, I always tell my students I'm not going to let them graduate until they've read Souls of Black Folk. But, these are books that speak to the challenges of democracy in America, right? Just how difficult it is to make democracy a reality, right? And how America has not lived up to its democratic ideals when it comes to the experiences of black people in this country. And we are still reckoning with that failure as Du Bois saw it, right? Can America be a true democracy if black people are not treated as full democratic citizens and equal human beings? Like, I mean, that's really kind of the fundamental question he was reckoning with in all of his works, right? From his dissertation on the transatlantic slave trade, to his book on John Brown, to Souls of Black Folk, Dark Water, Gift of Black Folk, Black Reconstruction, even the book he didn't finish, right? He's still wrestling with, can democracy work? And what can we do to make it work, especially when we're talking about this problem of the color line, right? Which is the problem of the 20th century as Du Bois described it. He would probably say it's a problem of the 21st century as well.
I just want us to give Professor Chad Williams a round of applause. Thank you so much for this gift. Thank you, and thank you everyone for sale over here, and you can come up and talk. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.